Good evening, Fort Collins. This is a work session tonight for the Fort Collins City Council for May 12th, 2015. We have 3 items on the agenda tonight. First being the social host and minor in possession offenses discussion that we're going to have. The second item is water supply reliability and storage update. And third is the Northern Integrated Supply Project and the Poudre River Health Framework. Just want to welcome everybody tonight, and I just want to point out that Council Member Ross Caniff will be phoning in tonight, and so it might I'll try to periodically make sure that Ross is participating, or he'll inform us of any questions, but I just wanted the viewing audience to know that as well. So with that, I'll turn to the city manager and have him kick off tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm going to quickly turn it over to Lori Kadrich. Lori is our Community Development and Neighborhood Services Director. Lori.
Thank you, and good evening, Mayor and Council members. Tonight, I'm here with the Police Services to introduce a concept for your consideration on a social host and underage consumption possession ordinance. And I heard that the mayor described it as the minor in possession, which is the words that I was using as well. And so I think for clarity, it might be helpful if Officer Younts could describe the difference between the minor in possession and the underage consumption.
I think we'll need a little bit more context first, just about what we're trying to do with the social host ordinance and then the minor in possession, just to kind of sort those things out a little bit.
We can do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So the first 3 questions that we have for you tonight is, does the City Council direct staff to develop a public engagement plan to consider a social host ordinance? Secondly, does the City Council direct staff to develop a public engagement plan to consider underage possession or consumption of alcohol? And then what time frame is appropriate for public review and comment? So a little bit of background is we were approached by a community group and others. Team Fort Collins was one of the groups that approached us with considering an ordinance which is described as a social host ordinance. The intent behind the social host ordinance is to prevent underage drinking, and the theory behind it is that in addition to holding the person who is drinking responsible, it also holds the host of a party or a host of a gathering. And this could be a small gathering or a large gathering. I think many folks think of a social host as someone who's hosting a large party that might get out of control, and this ordinance, if it were adopted, would apply to that, but it also would apply to situations where there might be a home base situation where maybe parents are providing alcohol or marijuana to their own child, and then other underage parties are present in the home, and this ordinance, if adopted, would apply to that as well. One of the unique situations in Fort Collins is that many aspects of a traditional social host ordinance are already found in our local public nuisance ordinance, and we would propose that if this were to move forward, we would incorporate it into what's already been adopted in Fort Collins. The public nuisance ordinance as it stands today is in place primarily to address nuisance gatherings or unreasonable noise. And the history of this project, as I've met and visited with others, has really come to fruition to say that Fort Collins has taken a very strong approach to remedy the impact of nuisance gatherings or large parties on their neighbors. And as such, we were early on adopting ordinances that would hold those who were holding the party accountable, and then if there was a landlord or a tenant in place, then notice to the landlord or tenant to say you can't continue doing this. And that is something that's been in place for a while. It holds a property owner liable if you knowingly permit, and then there are civil penalties after notices of violations. This has worked remarkably well in Fort Collins. So when I looked at the statistics behind the public notices, we have issued since inception over 4,000 first violations. Second violation drops to 500. The third violation drops to 95. The fourth violation drops to 16, and we've only had 2 instances of a 5th violation, and the last time we did that full sequence of notice was in 2004. So this program has been very effective in notifying landowners and tenants and others of what their responsibilities are in the community. And the thinking of the committee was that we could just incorporate in other aspects of the social host proposals that were not already adopted. The underage possession, and Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind explaining what that is then.
The reason we're not calling it minor in possession is legally a minor is someone under 18 years of age, but the underage possession and consumption applies to anyone under 21 because the legal drinking age in Colorado is 21. And it mirrors the state underage possession or consumption of alcohol law.
And then the other proposal for this is that we would also recommend, if the council move forward on it, that we would mirror the state law by sealing the record on the first offense, which would then, if someone was charged with this, would not create a criminal record that would follow them if it was the first offense only. We've done some outreach on this and been approached by various members of the community, primarily Team Fort Collins, who is a strong advocate for this ordinance and has also reached out to a variety of groups in the community to discuss it. We've met with stakeholders from Colorado State University, and we're hoping that we have reached an agreement between the two that would support these ordinances going forward. The other community concern that we haven't done as much outreach towards would be the actual property owners, including potential parents. So typically, we would not bring for your review tonight any draft ordinances, but because of the unique circumstances of this, as we looked at it, so much of the ordinance would be identical to what was in the public nuisance ordinance, that we do have for you tonight draft ordinances that you can look at and then provide direction to us as to whether you would like us to move forward with the public engagement plan for either the social host ordinance or the underage possession and consumption of alcohol, and what time frame might be appropriate for public review and comment on this. The staff recommendation from the police side as well as the nuisance enforcement is to recommend adoption or recommend moving forward towards adoption of these ordinances. We feel like that it is a tool that's currently being, is absent from our approach to stopping underage drinking in the community. And I think in one of the meetings it was said very well that the approach we've taken in Fort Collins is to address the impacts of underage drinking, but not really talk about not or stopping underage drinking and or possession of marijuana from occurring. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Lori and Officer Yance. Who would like to start off tonight?
I'll ask
Ray, go ahead.
just a light question. When you keep saying underage drinking, you're talking about someone under 21, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then, have you seen this become a real nuisance? Maybe I'm having you repeat yourself, but has this become a nuisance in our community that we need this extra law?
I can speak to that. Yes. So over the years, as you're probably aware, some of the largest complaints we get, especially in certain areas of town, are related to various noise party type issues. And so as Lori said, over the years we've done, we've really evolved and implemented a whole lot of different programs and ordinances to address kind of the symptoms, the actual loud noise that people are hearing and complaining on, maybe the trash, the cups or something in their neighborhood, some of those symptoms. But speaking from someone who goes on these calls a lot, what we've done is the amount of noise complaints we get have definitely gone down. The parties have gotten smaller in terms of their impact in those ways. But we see a lot of underage drinkers. Sometimes there can be hundreds of people at these parties, and many of them are underage and many of them are drinking. And we don't have an effective tool other than trying to pick off a few and write them under the state statute for underage drinking. Resource-wise, it's not like we can stop them all, or that would be the best approach either. So we've been able to hold the people throwing the party accountable for the noise and for the nuisance stuff, one of the components of that, probably the more often used one, is the trash that they may be causing in their neighborhood. But we've really not found an effective way to hold the host accountable for the fact that they are hosting this party where there's a whole bunch of underage people that are drinking alcohol at the party. Some of the results we see are individual in terms of it's not uncommon for us to deal with medical issues with underage people that are having, passed out or having medical problems associated with the fact that they've drank too much, and at their age it impacts their bodies more. And then another major one is the impact on the community that we see when, dozens and sometimes hundreds of people leave a party. They're intoxicated. They're walking down the street being very noisy, very disruptive to the neighborhoods, and things that we think would be lessened if they weren't intoxicated to begin with. Behaviors that we often see by people who are less inhibited because of the impacts of alcohol. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of numbers. Have you seen the number of those types of parties go up, or something that you feel like with our existing laws are not capable of managing or handling?
We've actually seen the number of house parties hasn't necessarily gone up. Because we've done such a good job over the years as a community addressing that from many different angles. What we have seen increase dramatically is the number of crowds of people roaming the neighborhoods, for lack of better terms. And that's in part because we live in a different age now of social media, where in the past, there had to be some kind of advertisement, some kind of knowledge that there was going to be a party at a certain house. Now it can be as simple as someone sending out some kind of social media of, hey, we're moving to this next place, and crowds are forming and roving in the streets. And those are where we're getting a lot more complaints, definitely a huge increase in complaints about noise, disruption, and other unlawful behaviors associated with these groups that are leaving parties and going to another one and moving through the neighborhood streets.
And what primary groups are those? Are you talking about college students?
A lot of them are, yes.
So that's the primary increase that you've seen is with the college students then?
Yes.
Right. It's not in the residential where families are hosting graduation parties and
No.
things like that, or anything like that?
Well, graduation parties certainly can be big and attract those types of behaviors. But in terms of a family having a family reunion, they're generally going to one place and staying there. Those generally aren't the people that are, when that party's breaking up, that they're moving on to another one.
Okay. Okay. I'm just leery in the sense of how many laws do we need to remedy the problem? And if you're doing a good job with that, and if your concern is about them roaming the streets and going from party to party, maybe there's a different approach than this. I'm just trying to think outside the box is all I'm doing. I'm not saying I'm not poo-pooing this or anything like that. I'm just trying to think, if that's what the concern is.
That's one of the concerns, but another concern is, quite honestly, we've set the tone in our community for expectations in terms of being good neighbors and not being disruptive in terms of noise and trash in your neighborhoods, and we've been pretty effective at that. The size and the disruption of the parties since when I started here 20 years ago versus what we see now is reduced. But there's what we see is that a lot of people under 21 know that they can go, and as long as they leave when the party's broken up or when the police ask them to, that there's really no response or consequences for the fact that they are drinking underage. And that's a big issue. We've had instances in over the years where we've even had students die of alcohol poisoning, and we really feel as a community that we need to be not just saying, hey, you can go and party and drink as long as you're not too loud or you don't drop your cup. It really feels like we're missing a huge component of that, which is that, at the end of the day, which really is, more of an important issue. Is it dozens or hundreds of kids drinking underage and the risks that brings to them and to other people in the community? Is that less important than the fact that they're being noisy?
So you think by having this kind of law, that would change that picture then?
Yes.
You wouldn't have big parties anymore, they
No,
wouldn't
I'm
go
not.
on the streets?
No, just like the stuff we did on the noise stuff certainly didn't make them go away.
Right.
It's not like we no longer have loud parties, we do. But there's mechanisms in place that have reduced the frequency and the intensity of those. And that would be the hope here. We're not going to eradicate people drinking under 21, and that's not realistic. It's more to just try to reduce the instance of that and try to ensure that it's not just a situation where that particular issue is not being addressed in a holistic manner, so that we can try to reduce the instance of that. And because right now it's extremely difficult. Again, we could go and try to pick off a couple people and write tickets under the state ordinance for underage consumption, but realistically, with the resources we may have at that party, there could be 100 people there, and we might be able to contact 3 or 4. And right now we have difficulty holding the person throwing the party accountable for the alcohol portion of that, because under the state law for providing alcohol to underage persons, we have to be able to prove that that host specifically provided the liquor to that person at their party. That's difficult to do, and quite honestly, sometimes the host isn't the one providing the liquor. Sometimes they don't necessarily have a keg there that they're serving, but people are because they encourage people to bring their own liquor, and so there's people bringing liquor to the party. So the host is holding the party, knowing that they have a party with a bunch of underage people that are drinking alcohol, but if they're not providing it, then there's no recourse.
So the crime would be for hosting the party?
Correct.
Would become a crime now?
Hosting a party, well, it's a civil infraction.
Civil?
Yes.
Okay. But you issue a citation or not?
Right, it would be a civil penalty for the citation. And one of the things that we learned when we did the research from other communities that have adopted it is that they saw a reduction in the number of parties, in the intensity of the parties that were being hosted. And what they did was a lot of education towards people to say, if you're going to host a party, it's your responsibility to ensure that everyone who is present is of legal age to be drinking. And so the types of activities began to change and the dialogue began to change in those communities.
And it's a civil infraction, but you said on the first offense there'd be no record of it. On the second offense, is it also a civil infraction, or is it turned into a criminal?
I'm sorry, I might be confusing the two issues. So the social host ordinance is proposed to be a civil infraction.
Okay.
The underage drinking is a criminal offense. So,
Right.
and
But
then
they-
that one would have the record sealed. So two separate ordinances, underage drinking, criminal, but the first offense is sealed. Under the social host, generally, all of those would be civil in nature unless it ever reached the point where after the fifth notice and they violated a court order or something like that. But those are all a civil, proposed to be a civil penalty.
So that would be like under the public nuisance then?
That's correct.
And then they'd be in essence being cited for public nuisance after the fifth or something. What happens then?
That's right.
So they get kicked out of their house, or what happens? How many civils do they get?
It depends on the type of violation. So if you have two of the same violation in 6 months,
Okay.
then there's a further penalty. If you have 3 within 12 months of any kind of public nuisance, then there's a further notice that you have. And so it depends on the amount of those and the combination.
What are the penalties, though? The civil, that's what I'm talking about.
Yes, I can look those up for you.
Okay. Why don't we, Gino, you ready to go?
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate you guys taking this on. It's definitely a whole different animal today than it was 20 years ago, and social media has definitely come to play a role in it. So I'm just curious on I just need some clarification while I'm pondering this a little bit more, but if there was a party held at your house and you weren't there, are you still then the host, or you have to be at the party to be the host?
Yes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe the way it's currently written is you have to be in control of the premise. You have to be there.
You have to be there. So if you're away on vacation, kids have a house party, you're not hosting the party even though your house is hosting the party?
Correct. So if you were going to be issued a citation at the time for a violation of the social host ordinance, you need to be present. If you're not present, but your tenant or your family member is having that, then you would receive the public nuisance ordinance notice that would give you a warning that says this activity happened at your home. Please don't do that again in the next 6 months, or you may face further.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what if you're having a high school party and you're not serving and you don't have any idea that they're consuming? I mean, they're pretty crafty, especially if we're talking about high schoolers or college-aged individuals who aren't of age yet. Are you guilty automatically? That's what it sounds like to me. And I'm just concerned that we're taking out some of the process that takes place today. I mean, there should be, in my mind, some evidence that you've contributed to that illegal activity. So how do we mitigate that? I'm all for, increasing safety and trying to help give you guys the tools to do your job. I want to make sure there's not ways we can adjust what we have to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, and we're not being unfair, overreaching the other way. So how would you deal with that situation?
Well, so you said, how are you contributing to the illegal activity? And I guess my response is you are. I mean, that's what we're trying to get at is if I host a party and I allow a whole bunch of underage, or any underage drinkers, quite honestly, but I allow people under 21 to come in and bring alcohol and drink in my residence, I am contributing because I'm providing the venue for this to happen. Had I not provided that, they may have found another one, but the point being is that there is a contribution, I feel, and a recognition that, as the person in control of that residence, I do have a responsibility for, what the behaviors of the people that are in my house that I'm permitting to happen.
And I think I agree with that. I'm just thinking out loud here. Let's say I have a kid that's graduating high school and she has a party at the house where I'm not providing any alcohol. There's no alcohol there. They're playing volleyball in the backyard. I'm not standing over them to ensure that they're not drinking. But again, they're pretty crafty, and it's likely someone could have a backpack or who knows, or go to the car and come back. I don't even know what's going on. How would you react to that with me being the owner of the home?
Yeah, so how I would react, I can answer that as a police officer.
Yeah.
And I mean,
or how would this ordinance deal with that?
Right,
Yeah.
and that's the difficulty with almost any ordinance is it's impossible to write an ordinance to recognize all the possible scenarios, and that's where discretion and reason comes into play, which as the police department uses on a daily basis in terms of if we show up and we don't feel that that truly that you had any knowledge of that you weren't knowingly permitting this to occur, aware that it was occurring, then we quite honestly wouldn't be writing the ticket, just as we do in many other situations. This is somewhat, I guess, similar to the way the liquor code may apply to a bar or a liquor license establishment, in terms of they're responsible for the behaviors of the people in the bar, and they can't, even if they're not providing that liquor, they can't allow underage people to come in and be drinking on their premise, even if the underage people are bringing the liquor in themselves. Right. It's kind of similar to that, but yet, if we as a police department went into a liquor license establishment and there was someone who had snuck something in a pocket and went into the restroom, and no one knew about it, and it was pretty clear that the liquor establishment wasn't being unreasonable in terms of turning a blind eye to it. They were doing their due diligence, but yet someone managed to sneak something in. We would never write that.
Right.
And it's kind of similar to that type of situation.
Thank you.
I'd like to go to Ross next. Ross, are you ready for a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, thanks. So I'll be brief just because I know how annoying it is to listen to people on the phone. Kind of start with the answers to the questions. First, yes, I do believe that we should do a public engagement plan to consider the social host ordinance as well as a public engagement plan for underage possession. And then I think an appropriate time frame is a fairly significant one. This is a large change, and so I think a fair amount of feedback should be solicited. I don't have a specific time frame, but probably in the several month kind of time frame, and get some publicity, get some significant feedback at various events, back to school events and other type things. And neighborhood meetings, we've got the neighborhood night outs coming up this summer. I think that would be a good opportunity for soliciting some feedback. As far as a rationale, and I hear what Ray and Gino are saying about excessive legislation, but I think this isn't really excessive as far as I see it. The idea that this is a civil infraction is similar to some of the other code changes that we've made recently that makes the penalty less severe and yet still reasonable and still something that is an incentive to obey the code. The problem that I've seen anecdotally both in my neighborhood as well as hearing from my constituents is that a party happens, the police show up, and then all of a sudden nobody seems to, quote, know anything about, boy, liquor? I had no idea. So having this civil liability for the host will help provide some accountability. And if we include the outreach and include some education, then parents can also tell their students, their kids, or people attending parties at their house, you know what? Don't be messing with this because I will get the brunt of this, and will not make me very happy. It's a tool for helping to provide that dialogue. And then also anecdotally, although some of the incidents of party houses has gone down, there's still significant problems I'm hearing from my constituents with underage drinking going on. And it's not just the noise, it's the breakup of the party as the kids are urinating in public or walking into the wrong house because they're so intoxicated. And these are much more likely to happen with underage drinkers who don't know their tolerance levels and who are more apt to overconsume because they're in a hurry or doing it discreetly or just don't know what alcohol is. The other important thing is that this also applies to marijuana, and I think we also want to discourage the underage consumption of marijuana as we move forward. As far as the criminalization of underage alcohol and marijuana possession goes, I think this is a reasonable follow-up and helps provide a framework for our own local enforcement of these statutes. And from what I can see, although I think outreach is needed additionally to the community on this one, it seems like this has reasonable clauses to help provide for public safety in terms of allowing a youth to call 911 or other ways that some of the worst impacts of overconsumption can be mitigated while holding the people who are trying to help harmless. So I appreciate that perhaps there needs to be much more dialogue on this, and I'm willing to do this, but from what I've seen, and I admit I've seen mostly from Team Fort Collins when they approached me a few months ago, but from what I've seen, this seems to be an effective tool for communities in situations like ours. Basically we have really ramped up, not we, the city of Fort Collins deliberately, but we, a culture, have ramped up the alcohol consumption side of things while we're also enabling the marijuana consumption side of things. And I think we need to have some of those tools to help mitigate the the impacts of that culture on those that are under 21. And I'm done for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ross. Kristen?
Yeah, I have some questions about some of the communities that have already enacted this law. So are they similar to our community? Are they college places? And have you seen a decrease in, for example, alcohol poisoning or death by alcohol poisoning or binge drinking? Or can you cite some of the statistics or let us know how much that does affect underage drinking?
One of the opportunities that we have in Fort Collins is that Wake Forest is studying the very thing that you've talked about in looking at the statistical analysis. So most of these ordinances are relatively new. So I don't have the statistics of before and after, other than in visiting with the officers and having that information relayed to us. And so again, the number of activities and then the intensity of the activity seems to slow after education on these events, when these ordinances are put into place. I think one of the complicating factors in trying to draw a comparison to Fort Collins, in my opinion, is when we looked at what other communities adopted for their social host. Their social host was broader in nature, so it covered some of the public nuisance things that are already in place in Fort Collins, and that's why I'm a little hesitant to try and draw the same, that we would have the same conclusion, because I think Fort Collins already had a significant improvement in what was happening in the neighborhoods related to these activities when the public nuisance ordinance was adopted. And so we have had great discussion about how much further will we get by adopting some of the other components.
Thanks. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Move forward with this. I think it's be a good, effective tool. One of the things I think it may be helpful for is as we see growth going on in the neighborhoods and community, I think this will be a useful tool. But also as the stadium comes online, I think there'll be a new dynamic for the neighborhood. So I think this will help you guys do your jobs. Curious as to what your thoughts are in terms of engaging the CSU community and even the high schools. Is there any thought gone into that? Presentations or something like that?
Yes, we agree with that. We think it's important. We've begun some dialogue with the CSU students through our CSU liaison. Team Fort Collins has also approached some of the groups to begin dialogue. And in our last project team meeting, when we met with Team Fort Collins, we discussed the need for education at the high school level as well. And they are approaching sources for grant funding to do that, as well as if the council indicates we move forward with considering a public engagement plan for these, we would also contact those groups.
Okay, good. Thank you.
May I go back to the question that Councilman Martinez
Yes, and
asked?
then I'd like to know, you said one of the communities was Wake Forest?
Wake Forest is interested in studying the statistical impact
Where
of
are they
these types
located?
of ordinances.
North Carolina?
And so Team Fort Collins has been working with Wake Forest in order to promote the use of a social host ordinance in our community and then study the impact of that going forward.
What other communities have utilized this?
This particular ordinance?
Yes.
There's a number of other communities, communities in Portland, for example, communities in Washington State, other communities in Colorado. So it's
Can you give me a list of communities later on?
yes,
in
I can
Colorado?
provide that.
Right, good. I've got just a couple of questions. Appreciate the questions and the answers so far. Just related to identifying the host, if it's in a clubhouse of an association, does that link to a host? You know, is it the property owner? How might that happen?
We actually discussed that quite a bit and refined the language on that a little bit. You know, pretty much because what you're talking about, because the property owner may be the HOA or the, you know, and they may not have anything to do with the actual party. They're just providing a location. So the host is defined as the person, and I don't have the exact wording, but it specifies the person who is, even if they're renting, whether they're renting or whether they own the location, they're renting the location is being provided for free. It's the person hosting the actual event.
Okay. And related to the outreach or the public engagement portion, I think this literally can potentially apply to most over 21 adults in terms of their implication, it possibly. And I'm just thinking Team Fort Collins works with a lot of the liquor stores in some of their programming. And what I'm thinking of is basically going through our liquor licenses and engaging some public outreach that way. Any thoughts in terms of engagement, in terms of, and it's not only alcohol but marijuana as well, so, as it relates to the social host. So, just awareness, and because potentially it could, it's a broad-based. I think it's difficult to target really specifically a group.
We agree, and we could add that to the list for outreach as well.
Okay, and I think, I think, and one of my reasons for pausing a little bit is, I think we jump to, and you have a lot of history of dealing with this on the street, but jumping to certain conclusions as to target audiences, and I don't think, as it relates to, that's the gatherings aspect of it, but as it relates to social host, that is, I think, less of a particular audience like necessarily students and other sorts of things. I would think that would be the case. And then just to be clear, and I know you've been clear in your presentation, but the social host is related to alcohol and marijuana for under 21 consumption, and then the underage is primarily for alcohol because the marijuana laws are more clear on that. Would you sort that out just in terms of, as it relates to alcohol and marijuana, in terms of the social host and the underage?
Mayor, you're correct that the proposal for the social host applies both to the alcohol and to marijuana. The reason that we don't have the underage consumption of alcohol and marijuana is because there's already a city ordinance that covers the marijuana portion.
Thank you. Gino.
Hey, a follow-up question here. So as I'm thinking through this, and what we're trying to solve, what percentage do you think we're talking about here? I mean, certainly if we know a parent is having a party and they're allowing drinking to take place or providing the alcohol, I don't think we're going to get much pushback from our community in trying to deal with that. So what percentage do you think? I think it's probably going to be more common that it's like a 22-year-old or 23-year-old that's having a party that has, other college students there, let's say, that aren't of age. Do you think, is that a larger portion of the issue you're seeing in our city right now, is those more college and high school parties that are unattended by a parent? Or do we really have that big of a problem in our community where parents are having parties and allowing consumption to take place?
No, we don't see that
Yeah.
very frequently.
So I would think it'd probably be dealing with that more college age or high school or having a party.
That's certainly what we see more frequently, is the ones where there is no parent or guardian involved, where it's just, regardless of what the ages happen to be, it's just friends and whatnot throwing parties for each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think as this, as you kind of boil this down and we look at really the target, I mean, the value proposition is pretty clear to me. It probably will address that population that I'm speaking of, is that college and the high school. And I think that some further public engagement probably makes sense in dealing with that. I think that most people, their first reaction to that is, you know, we're talking about parents here who, I mean, that was my first reaction to it.
Right.
And, you know, if I'm thinking through the process, like, all right, if the parent doesn't know it's taking place, or the parents aren't home, they're being ticketed, there's if you are there and you know it's being consumed and you're providing it, then you should be ticketed. I mean, that should be obvious. So I think I'm all right with moving forward from my perspective with some public engagement on that. And I think the review time should be whatever you guys think is necessary to accomplish that. Thanks for your effort on it.
Gina, Jerry?
I join some of Ross's comments on this. To me, it's in lots of the areas of the city that I represent, it is a huge issue. And yeah, I agree. It is not a parent issue. It's, you know, as you well know, our office here well knows, we have at times folks having parties and making money at the parties. And a lot of the people who come to pay the money are people who can't get the alcohol themselves. So, I mean, it's a business in some parties. Seriously, you get a keg and you sell it for so much for the cup to people to come. And so anyway, it is a problem. And even if it doesn't solve that much of it, I think it's a tool. I think it's increases the fear factor or the responsibility factor of those who want to hold these gatherings. Because as you pointed out, nuisance doesn't get them if they're not making noise. If they're not really causing a public nuisance, you have no rights to deal with them. But if you have a complaint dealing with it, that there's some proof or reasonable cause for there's underage drinking. So to me, it makes sense. So I'm yes on all three questions. I agree with Gina's comment. Whatever you think a proper sort of engagement is when you talk to the other people. But I think we need to move ahead. If we get pushback from the community, we do. But I just think of the Avery Park neighborhood as one that officers are in every weekend dealing with these sorts of parties. And it's another way, in my mind, to get some of these residences back to residences and out of being party places.
Yep.
And the only thing I would like to know is, again, the list of the communities, but the penalties, I need to know that. That's important to me.
Sorry. On the actual hosting, there is a civil penalty. But if you're the property owner, like what Councilman Campana has asked about, then the requirement for that property owner is to abate the nuisance. And that's why our numbers go down. So there's not a civil penalty on top of that. You abate the nuisance after you receive the warning. And then the other area might be is if the nuisance was not abated, then we could try to recover the cost related to abating that. And I think the example I've heard before is when the one pool party was very expensive and got out of control, then the public nuisance ordinance was used to recover the cost of that.
So there was a means to do that without this ordinance?
Yes, yes. But again, there was, in that case, there was the public nuisance spillover for noise and other kinds of activities. It wasn't just the underage drinking.
Okay. And then if you pose that and they still didn't follow and they violated a third time within a year or something, didn't you say there was another step?
I'm going to defer to legal for that because it's,
Here they come.
yes, thank you.
If there's a violation of
Speaker.
There you go.
If there's a third violation of the social host ordinance within a 12-month period,
Yeah.
then it would normally be a civil infraction, but it could turn into a criminal misdemeanor. And that's the way the code's currently written.
So what would be the criminal offense then?
The criminal,
The social,
it would still be social host, but it would turn into a criminal misdemeanor, and that's at the discretion of the
Okay.
prosecutors as well as the officers.
okay, all right, that helps, yeah. And I do see this as it's, if, obviously, we'd want good discretion, but you're right, college students that host these parties, and then everybody comes, and then how do you target that? And I think once you enforce something like that, but obviously I want to see the social outreach with ASCSU as well, and talking to many of the university students about this, because that's who it's going to impact. That's obviously what is, in my mind, that's what it's targeting, So I'd like to see what their feedback is, and I'd like to see some of the communities around Colorado, some of their feedback and how that's worked for them too.
Okay.
I think we're in the right direction.
Okay. So just reviewing, it looks like that there's been general consensus to move forward with the public engagement related to the draft ordinances on both the social host as well as the underage possession aspect of this. In terms of the time frame, I've heard a number of things. I don't know if it's been sorted out. Some is leading into the fall and using some of the fall welcome and neighborhood night out in August as ways to gather input. So that puts it in the, 3 to 4 months kind of category in terms of public review and comment. Is that was that a good summary, Kristen?
Well, students are about to leave, and then they're not coming back till the end of August, so I think if we want any engagement with the university, I think you need to push it back a little further into the fall.
Good point.
I agree with that. And then I'd be curious to see how the university will react to that if we impose to, like, on one of their students happen to get a social host violation. Will they react to that or not, and like they do other criminal offenses?
Okay. So no, I think that's good. So is there a clear direction? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation.